The mountain wind carried the sound of engines across the valley, breaking the morning stillness like thunder before a storm. Jake Mitchell stood on his porch, rifle in hand, watching three black SUVs speed down the dirt road toward his ranch. Dust clouds billowed behind them, and through the windshield of the lead vehicle, he could see a face he'd hoped never to encounter again. Robert Carson sat in the passenger seat, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place against the rugged Montana landscape, his cold eyes fixed on the ranch house with predatory intensity. Behind Jake, the screen door creaked open, and Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. Before we jump back to see how Jake and Sarah's story began, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He found me. The words were barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of months of fear, of sleepless nights, and constant looking over her shoulder. Jake felt her presence behind him, felt the way her body tensed as the vehicles drew closer. She'd been safe here for 4 months, hidden away on his remote cattle ranch, healing from wounds that went far deeper than the physical bruises that had faded weeks ago. Now, as the convoy pulled to a stop just outside his gate, Jake knew their peaceful sanctuary was about to be shattered. Carson stepped out of the lead SUV, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who moved with the calculated precision of hired muscle. Behind them, a third vehicle disgorged what looked like a sheriff's deputy and a man carrying a briefcase who could only be a lawyer. The morning sun caught the badge on the deputy's chest, but Jake couldn't make out which county it belonged to. It didn't matter. Carson had always been good at buying the right people, at making legal documents appear when he needed them. Sarah. Carson's voice carried across the yard, smooth and cultured, the same voice that had once whispered promises and threats in equal measure. You've caused me quite a bit of trouble, darling. Time to come home where you belong. Jake stepped forward, positioning himself between the gate and the house, his rifle held loosely but ready. For months ago, he'd been just another lonely rancher struggling to keep his family's legacy alive. Now, staring down the man who'd nearly destroyed the woman he'd come to love, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. This is private property, Carson, Jake called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. You're not welcome here. Carson's laugh was cold, calculating. He gestured to the deputy, who stepped forward with an official-looking document. I'm afraid I have a court order that says otherwise, Mr. Mitchell. My fiancée has been missing for months, suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. The state has granted me guardianship to ensure she receives proper medical care. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Fiancé. The ring Sarah had thrown at Carson's feet the night she fled was apparently still binding in his mind, still giving him legal claim over her life. Jake glanced back at Sarah, seeing the color drain from her face as the nightmare she'd escaped threatened to reclaim her. But there was something different in her expression now, something that hadn't been there when she'd first collapsed at his door. Broken and terrified. Steel. Determination. The strength she'd found here on the ranch, working alongside him, discovering who she really was beneath the layers of manipulation and control Carson had wrapped around her. I'm not going anywhere. With you, Robert, Sarah said, stepping out from behind Jake to stand beside him. Her voice was stronger than Jake had expected, clearer. And I'm not your fiancé. I ended our engagement the night you put me in the hospital. Carson's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage that simmered beneath his polished exterior. You're not well, Sarah. You don't know what you're saying. That's why I'm here, to help you. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, and Jake caught a glimpse of doubt in the man's expression. Whatever Carson had told him about Sarah's condition clearly didn't match the composed woman standing on the porch. But doubt wasn't enough to stop a legal document, and Jake could see the calculation in Carson's eyes. This was just the opening move in what would be a much larger game. Jake's mind raced, thinking of the calls he'd need to make, the allies he'd need to gather. Sheriff Linda Garrett in Pine Valley knew the truth about Sarah's situation, but her jurisdiction ended at the county line. Father Miguel had connections throughout the state, people who might be able to help. And there was Sarah's evidence, the photos and medical records she'd been gathering, documenting Carson's abuse. But all of that would take time. They might not have. The standoff stretched on, tension crackling between the two groups like electricity before a lightning strike. Carson checked his expensive watch with deliberate casualness, a gesture designed to show he held all the cards. You have 5 minutes to say goodbye, Sarah. Then we're leaving. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Jake felt Sarah's hand touch his arm, a brief contact that somehow conveyed everything they'd built together over the past months.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The early morning conversations over coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. The way she'd thrown herself into ranch work, learning to read the signs that meant a cow was ready to calve, staying up all night in the barn during difficult births. The quiet moments on the porch after long days, when they'd talked about everything and nothing, slowly healing each other's wounds without even realizing it. Jake, she said softly, her voice meant only for him. Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For showing me what it means to be valued for who I am, not what someone wants me to be. He turned to face her, seeing tears in her eyes, but also that same steel he'd glimpsed moments before. This isn't over, he promised, his voice low and fierce. I won't let him take you. But even as he spoke the words, Jake could see Carson's men moving closer to the gate, could see the deputy's hand resting on his weapon. The legal document in the lawyer's briefcase might as well be a gun pointed at Sarah's head. Carson had used the system before to control her, to make her disappear when she became inconvenient. He was doing it again now, cloaked in the authority of court orders and medical guardianship. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers, the smell of the freedom Sarah had found here. In the distance, Jake could hear his cattle lowing in the pasture, the sound of the life they'd built together. A life that was about to be torn apart by a man who saw Sarah as property to be reclaimed rather than a person with the right to choose her own path. Carson stepped closer to the gate, his patience clearly wearing thin. Time's up, Sarah. Don't make me call for additional assistance. The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of concern, but unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle, but he knew that violence would only give Carson the excuse he needed to paint Jake as the dangerous one, the unstable rancher who'd kidnapped and brainwashed a vulnerable woman. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the tension, and Jake felt a surge of hope as he recognized the familiar rumble of Tommy Rodriguez's pickup truck. Behind it came Father Miguel's old sedan and Betty Williams' delivery van. Word had somehow spread through Pine Valley's tight-knit community, and the cavalry was arriving. But as the vehicles pulled up behind Carson's convoy, Jake realized they might be too late. The deputy was already opening the gate, and Carson's men were moving toward the house with the confidence of people who held all the legal cards. Sarah, Carson called out, his voice taking on a note of false urgency. You're clearly not thinking straight. These people have filled your head with paranoid delusions. But I'm here to help you, to get you the treatment you need. The way he said it, the practiced concern in his voice, reminded Jake of everything Sarah had told him about Carson's methods. How he'd systematically isolated her from friends and family, convinced everyone around them that she was unstable, that her fears were imaginary. Jake watched Sarah's face as Carson spoke, saw the way she flinched at the familiar manipulation. But there was something else there too, a recognition of the tactics being used against her and a refusal to be drawn back into that web of control. For months of freedom, of being valued and trusted, had changed her in ways Carson clearly hadn't anticipated. The only thing wrong with me, Robert, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the yard with startling clarity, is that it took me too long to see what you really are. Carson's facade cracked further, and for a moment, Jake saw the real man. Beneath the polish, cold, calculating, and utterly without empathy. It was the same look Sarah had described from that final night, when Carson's mask had fallen away completely and she'd seen the true extent of his capacity for violence. The deputy was getting nervous, clearly sensing that this wasn't the simple medical intervention he'd been told it would be. Tommy Rodriguez had gotten out of his truck and was walking toward them, his mechanic's coveralls and work-worn hands a stark contrast to Carson's expensive entourage. Behind him, Father Miguel moved with the quiet authority that came from decades of counseling people through their darkest moments. Gentlemen, Father Miguel called out, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. Perhaps we should discuss this situation like civilized people. There are clearly two sides to this story. Carson's lawyer stepped forward, briefcase in hand, clearly prepared to shut down any interference. This is a legal matter, Father. Mr. Carson has proper documentation granting him guardianship of his fiancée. Any interference with that process could result in charges of obstruction. But Tommy Rodriguez wasn't intimidated by legal threats. Funny thing about legal documents, he said, his voice deceptively casual. Sometimes they're based on false information. Sometimes the people who sign them don't know the whole truth. He gestured toward Sarah, who stood straighter under the support of her chosen community. Sarah's been staying in Pine Valley for months now. We've all seen her every day. She's not crazy, not unstable. She's a woman who finally found the courage to escape an abusive situation. The word abusive hung in the air like a challenge, and Jake saw Carson's jaw clench. This wasn't going according to his plan. He'd expected to find Sarah broken and isolated, easy to reclaim through legal manipulation. Instead, he was facing a united community that had seen her strength, had witnessed her healing, and wasn't about to let her be dragged back into hell without a fight. For months earlier, Jake Mitchell stood in the early morning mist that clung to the valleys of his Montana ranch, watching his pregnant cows with the careful eye of a man who'd learned that life and death often balanced on moments of attention. The calving season was approaching, that intense period when every day could bring new life or heartbreaking loss, when split-second decisions meant the difference between a healthy calf and an emergency that could cost him thousands of dollars. He didn't have. At 35, Jake had been running the Mitchell Ranch alone for 3 years, ever since his father's heart attack had left him the sole guardian of 2,000 acres and nearly 300 head of cattle. The loneliness had crept up on him gradually, like the morning fog that rolled down from the mountains. At first, he'd been too busy learning the business side of ranching, too overwhelmed by veterinary bills and feed costs and the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply faster than his cattle. His father had handled all of that, leaving Jake to focus on the physical work, the fence repairs, and hay cutting and the 100 other tasks that kept a ranch running. When Jake found himself suddenly responsible for everything, the isolation of ranch life went from peaceful solitude to something that gnawed at him during the long winter evenings. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and Pine Valley, the closest town, was little more than a collection of buildings clustered around Highway 89 like survivors huddled around a campfire. The town had been slowly dying for decades, young people leaving for opportunities in Billings or Missoula, leaving behind an aging population that grew smaller each year. Jake made his weekly trips to Williams' General Store for supplies, exchanged pleasantries with Betty Williams and whoever else happened to be hanging around the pot-bellied stove, but these brief social interactions only highlighted how empty his days had become. The ranch house reflected his isolation. Built by his grandfather in the 1940s, it had once housed a family of 6, but now Jake rattled around in rooms that had grown dusty from disuse. His mother's china still sat in the cabinet where she'd left it. His sister's childhood artwork still decorated the refrigerator, fading reminders of when the house had been filled with voices and laughter. Jake had thought about taking down the pictures, putting away the mementos that made his solitude feel heavier, but somehow he couldn't bring himself to erase those last traces of family warmth. The kitchen table where he ate his solitary meals had once been the heart of family discussions, where his father planned each day's work and his mother managed the household finances. Now it held nothing but Jake's laptop and stacks of veterinary journals, his attempts to educate himself about the complex medical issues that arose during calving season. Every year, he lost calves that an experienced veterinarian might have saved, but the nearest large animal vet was Dr. Mason in Pine Valley, and at 65, the old man was talking more and more about retirement. Jake had been dreading the approaching calving season more than usual. Last year had been brutal, with a late spring storm that had caught him off guard and cost him a dozen calves. He'd spent sleepless nights in the barn, pulling calves, administering medications he only half understood, watching helplessly as complications arose that were beyond his ability to handle. The financial loss had been devastating, but the emotional toll had been worse. Each dead calf represented his failure to provide proper care, his inadequacy as a rancher, and as the inheritor of his family's legacy. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his cattle begin to stir as the first hints of sunrise touched the mountain peaks. Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. In 6 weeks, maybe less, the first calves would start arriving. He'd upgraded his equipment, bought new supplies, read everything he could find about bovine obstetrics, but he knew that when complications arose, when a calf was breech or a cow was in distress, all the book learning in the world couldn't replace experienced hands and quick thinking. He'd placed an ad in the regional newspaper weeks ago, hoping to find someone with veterinary experience willing to work for room and board, plus a modest salary. The responses had been disappointing, mostly students looking for summer work who had enthusiasm but no practical experience with large animals. One promising lead had fallen through when the candidate took a position with a larger operation that could offer better pay. Jake was beginning to think he'd be facing another calving season alone, armed with nothing but determination and a prayer that this year would be kinder than the last. The isolation wasn't just about the work, though that was part of it. At 35, Jake was watching his contemporaries start families, build lives that extended beyond the boundaries of their property. His high school girlfriend had married a teacher in Billings and now sent him Christmas cards featuring photos of her growing family. His college roommate had become a successful engineer in Seattle, his social media filled with vacation photos and dinner parties that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Jake had chosen this life, had wanted to preserve his family's ranch, but he hadn't anticipated how completely it would separate him from the normal rhythms of social connection. Saturday nights in Pine Valley offered limited entertainment. The Copper Kettle Diner served decent food and functioned as an informal social club, but the conversations rarely moved beyond weather and cattle prices. The closest thing to nightlife was the volunteer fire department's monthly bingo game at the community center, attended mostly by retirees and married couples with deep roots in the area. Jake had tried dating women from Billings, driving 3 hours each way for dinner and a movie, but the distance made relationship building nearly impossible. Most women weren't interested in a man whose idea of a good time was checking fence lines and whose closest neighbors were four-legged. The physical demands of ranch work kept Jake fit and strong, but they also left him bone-tired most evenings, too exhausted for the kind of social activities that might lead to meaningful connections. By the time he finished his daily chores, cleaned up, and grabbed a quick dinner, it was usually past 8 o'clock, and the prospect of driving to town for a social gathering held little appeal. Instead, he'd settled into a routine of solitary evenings, reading veterinary journals or watching whatever sports happened to be on his ancient television, falling asleep in his recliner more often than in his bed. The approaching calving season had intensified his awareness of his isolation. During previous years, he'd at least had his father's experience to draw on, the comfort of knowing that someone else understood the stakes and shared the responsibility. Now, every decision would be his alone. Every loss would be his fault. Every success would feel hollow without someone to share it with. The ranch that had once felt like a legacy now felt more like a burden, a weight that was slowly crushing him under its demands. Jake's relationship with his cattle was perhaps the closest thing he had to consistent companionship. He knew each cow individually, could spot signs of illness or distress from across the pasture, took pride in providing them with the best care he could manage. But cattle, no matter how well cared for, couldn't fill the human need for conversation, for shared experiences, for the simple comfort of another person's presence during the long Montana winters. They couldn't help him make difficult decisions or celebrate small victories or provide the emotional support that made hard work feel worthwhile. The financial pressures of running the ranch alone had also contributed to his isolation. Every dollar spent on social activities was a dollar that couldn't go toward ranch improvements or emergency veterinary bills. Jake had learned to live frugally, to find his entertainment in library books and free outdoor activities. But this economic constraint further limited his opportunities to meet people and build relationships. The irony wasn't lost on him that he owned 2,000 acres of some of the most beautiful land in Montana, but felt trapped by the very property that should have been his freedom. As the sun climbed higher, painting the pasture in shades of gold and green, Jake's cattle began their slow migration toward the water tank near the barn. He counted them automatically, a habit ingrained by years of experience, noting which cows were showing signs of approaching labor, which ones might need extra attention in the coming weeks. The routine was comforting in its predictability, but it also reminded him of how completely his life had become defined by the needs of his animals rather than his own human desires for connection and companionship. Walking back toward the house, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window and was startled by what he saw. The man looking back at him appeared older than his 35 years, weathered by wind and sun and the constant stress of sole responsibility. His father had always looked vital and engaged, energized by the challenges of ranch life. But Jake saw weariness in his own face, a resignation that worried him. He'd always assumed he'd eventually find someone to share this life with, that the ranch would once again be filled with family. But as the years passed, that future seemed increasingly unlikely. The truth was that Jake needed help with more than just the calving season. He needed someone who understood the rhythms of ranch life, who could appreciate the satisfaction of work well done and the beauty of sunrise over the mountains. He needed a partner who could see past the isolation and financial constraints to the deeper rewards of this way of life. Most of all, he needed someone who could help him remember why he'd chosen to preserve his family's legacy in the first place, why this land and these cattle mattered enough to justify the sacrifices he'd made. Standing on his porch, looking out over the vast expanse of his property, Jake Mitchell had no way of knowing that his prayers for help and companionship were about to be answered in a way he never could have imagined. He couldn't know that within hours, a woman fleeing for her life would stumble into his world, bringing with her the veterinary skills he desperately needed and the possibility of connection he'd almost given up hoping for. The morning mist was beginning to lift from the valley, revealing the familiar landscape he'd known all his life, but everything was about to change in ways that would challenge and transform them both. Part 2. The discovery. Jake had been driving back from Pine Valley with feed supplies when he first spotted the figure stumbling along Highway 89. From a distance, it looked like someone walking, perhaps a stranded motorist, but as he drew closer, alarm bells began ringing in his mind. The person was weaving erratically, favoring one side, and appeared to be a woman in professional clothing completely unsuited for walking along a Montana highway in the spring chill. He pulled his truck over to the gravel shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and climbed out slowly. Years of dealing with injured animals had taught him to approach carefully, to read body language and assess the situation before acting. The woman had stopped walking and was watching him warily, her stance defensive despite her obvious exhaustion. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that had escaped from what had once been a neat ponytail. Her clothes told a story of their own, an expensive-looking blazer torn at the shoulder, dress pants stained with dirt, and what looked like blood, one shoe missing entirely. "Ma'am," Jake called out, keeping his distance and his voice calm. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, taking a step backward despite the fact that she was clearly struggling to stay upright. Her eyes darted past him to his truck, then to the empty highway stretching in both directions, calculating escape routes even in her diminished state. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was hoarse and shaky, contradicting her words. "Just walking." The statement was so obviously false that Jake felt a surge of protective instinct. No one walked along this stretch of highway by choice, especially not in business attire with injuries that were becoming more apparent as he looked closer. Jake could see the signs of recent trauma written across her appearance. A bruise was darkening along her jawline, partially hidden by her hair, and the way she held her left arm suggested injury. Most telling was the fear in her eyes, the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to expect danger from unexpected places. He'd seen similar behavior in abused animals, the way they flinched from kindness because experience had taught them that human contact usually meant pain. "There's nothing out here for miles," Jake said gently, gesturing toward the empty landscape surrounding them. "No gas stations, no convenience stores. If you're trying to get somewhere, I can give you a ride to town. The sheriff's station is right on Main Street." He mentioned the sheriff deliberately, hoping to reassure her that he wasn't a threat, that there were official channels she could access if needed. The mention of law enforcement seemed to have the opposite effect. Her face paled, and she shook her head quickly. "No police," she said, the words coming out sharper than she'd apparently intended. "I mean, I don't need the police. I'm fine. But even as she spoke, she swayed on her feet, and Jake realized she was running on nothing but adrenaline and stubborn determination. Jake made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it at the time. Instead of pressing her about the police or trying to convince her to go to town, he took a different approach. "My name's Jake Mitchell," he said, settling back against his truck to appear less threatening. "I run a cattle ranch about 10 miles from here. If you need somewhere safe to rest, somewhere away from the main road, you're welcome to come with me." No questions asked. The offer hung in the air between them, and Jake could see her weighing her options. She was clearly fleeing from something or someone, and the thought of getting further away from the highway appealed to her. But trusting a stranger, even one who seemed genuinely concerned, was obviously difficult. Jake waited patiently, understanding that rushing her decision would only reinforce her obvious fear. "You said no questions," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. "No questions unless you want to answer them. And if you decide you want to leave, I'll drive you wherever you need to go." It was a promise he meant absolutely, though something in her desperate situation was already making him want to offer whatever protection he could. The woman looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read his character. In his expression, whatever she saw there must have convinced her that he was safe, or at least safer than whatever alternative she was considering. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Jake helped her into the passenger seat of his truck, noting how she winced when she moved her left arm and how she kept glancing in the side mirror as they pulled back onto the highway. She didn't offer her name, and true to his word, he didn't ask. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with unspoken questions and carefully maintained boundaries. As they turned off the highway onto the dirt road leading to his ranch, Jake found himself seeing his property through her eyes. The landscape was beautiful in its vastness, rolling hills covered in new spring grass stretching towards snow-capped mountains in the distance. But it was also isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a single winding road. For someone fleeing danger, it might represent either the perfect sanctuary or a trap with no escape route. "It's beautiful," she said softly, the first words she'd spoken since getting in the truck. There was genuine appreciation in her voice, and Jake felt a small surge of pride. He'd grown up surrounded by this landscape and sometimes took its majesty for granted, but seeing it through fresh eyes reminded him of why his family had chosen to build their lives here. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, and Jake tried to see it objectively. The log structure was solid and well-maintained, built to withstand Montana winters, but it was clearly a bachelor's residence. The porch needed paint, the flower beds his mother had once tended were overgrown with weeds, and the general air of the place suggested functionality over aesthetics. It was a home focused on the business of ranching rather than the softer touches. That made a house welcoming. Jake parked near the front porch and came around to help his passenger out of the truck, but she was already standing, though unsteadily. Up close, in the better light near the house, her injuries were more apparent. The bruising on her face was extensive, following patterns that suggested someone's hand, and the way she protected her left side indicated possible rib damage. Jake felt a cold anger building in his chest, recognizing the signs of deliberate violence. "Let's get you inside," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Get you cleaned up and looked at." She nodded, following him up the porch steps with careful, measured movements. Jake opened the front door and stepped aside to let her enter first, noting how she positioned herself near the doorway, maintaining an escape route even in her weakened state. The interior of the house reflected Jake's solitary lifestyle. The furniture was functional rather than decorative, the walls bare except for a few family photos, the overall atmosphere more like a comfortable hunting lodge than a family home. But it was clean and warm, and Jake could see some of the tension leave her shoulders as she took in the obviously unthreatening environment. "Bathrooms down the hall if you want to clean up," Jake said, then hesitated before adding, "There's a first aid kit in the medicine cabinet. Help yourself to whatever you need." She nodded gratefully and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Jake alone in his kitchen, trying to process what he'd gotten himself into. The sound of running water from the bathroom gave Jake time to think. His unexpected guest was clearly running from someone, Someone who'd hurt her badly enough to send her fleeing along a remote highway with no apparent destination in mind. The smart thing would probably be to convince her to contact the authorities, to get professional help dealing with whatever situation she was escaping. But something about her absolute refusal to involve police told him the situation was more complicated than simple assault. When she emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, the transformation was startling. With the dirt and blood washed away, he could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, probably in her late 20s, with intelligent dark eyes and delicate features that spoke of education and refinement. She'd cleaned her injuries as best she could, revealing the full extent of the bruising across her face and neck, but she moved with more confidence now, as if the simple act of washing had restored some of her strength. "Thank you," she said, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs Jake had pulled out for her. "For stopping, for bringing me here. I know it's an imposition." Jake shook his head, already filling the coffee pot with water. "No imposition. Coffee." She nodded, and he could see her relaxing slightly as the normal ritual of hospitality played out between them. As Jake prepared coffee, he found himself stealing glances at his guest, trying to piece together her story from the limited clues available. Her clothes, despite their damaged condition, were expensive and well-tailored. Her hands were soft, clearly unaccustomed to manual labor, and her speech patterns suggested education and urban background. She was obviously far from her usual environment, which raised questions about how she'd ended up walking along a remote Montana highway. The coffee finished brewing, and Jake poured 2 cups, setting one in front of her and settling into the chair across the table. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller with another person in it, but not uncomfortably so. If anything, the presence of another human being made the space feel more alive than it had in months. "I'm Sarah," she said suddenly, as if the kindness he'd shown had earned her at least that much information. "Sarah Hayes." Jake nodded, filing the name away. "Jake Mitchell, as I mentioned. This is my family's ranch. Been here about 60 years now." Sarah cupped her hands around the coffee mug as if drawing warmth from it, and Jake noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. Whatever had happened to her was recent enough that shock was still affecting her system. "How far are we from the nearest town?" she asked, and Jake heard the careful calculation in the question. "Pine Valley's about 15 miles that way," Jake said, gesturing toward the northeast. "Billings is about 3 hours if you need a bigger city. But honestly, there's not much between here and there except ranch land and mountains." He paused, then added carefully, "If someone's looking for you, this is about as isolated as you can get without heading into actual wilderness." Sarah's expression told him his guess had been accurate. She was hiding from someone, and the remoteness of his ranch was a feature, not a bug. "Would it be possible," she said hesitantly, "for me to stay here for a day or two, just until I figure out what to do next? I can pay you for room and board." Jake shook his head before she finished speaking. "You don't need to pay me anything. You're welcome to stay as long as you need." The words came out more quickly than he'd intended, revealing his eagerness for company even in these circumstances. "There's a guest room upstairs that doesn't get much use. Make yourself comfortable." The relief on Sarah's face was unmistakable, and Jake realized how much courage it had taken for her to ask. She was clearly used to independence, to managing her own problems, and needing help from a stranger must have been difficult. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. As evening approached, Jake went about his usual routine of checking on the cattle and securing the property for the night, but his awareness was split between his familiar tasks and the knowledge that there was someone waiting for him back at the house. It was a strange feeling, domestic in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood, and he found himself looking forward to returning to the warmth and conversation that Sarah's presence provided. Part 3. The revelation 3 days passed before Sarah felt safe enough to tell Jake her story. During that time, she'd helped with simple tasks around the ranch, moving carefully due to her injuries, but clearly eager to contribute rather than simply be a burden. Jake had been patient, asking no questions beyond practical ones about her needs and comfort. But he could sense the weight of secrets she carried and knew that eventually, the truth would need to come out. The revelation came on a quiet evening. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah had been quieter than usual during dinner, and Jake could sense her gathering courage for something difficult. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with the kind of weariness that came from carrying a heavy burden alone for too long. "I need to tell you why I was on that highway," she said, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. "You've been so kind to me, and you deserve to know what you've gotten yourself into by helping me." Jake nodded but didn't push, sensing that interrupting her now might cause her to lose her nerve. Sarah took a deep breath and began her story. She was Dr. Sarah Hayes, a veterinarian who'd been working for a large animal practice in Billings. Until 6 months ago, she'd specialized in bovine medicine, particularly reproductive health and obstetrics, skills that had made her valuable to ranchers throughout the region. Her practice had been growing, her reputation solid, and she'd been engaged to Robert Carson, a successful land developer who seemed to offer everything she thought she wanted in a partner. Robert was charming, Sarah said, her voice taking on a bitter edge. Sophisticated, successful, everything I thought I was looking for. He swept me off my feet with expensive dinners and romantic getaways. I thought I was lucky to have found someone who appreciated my ambition and supported my career. She paused, staring out at the darkening sky. I should have recognized the warning signs, but I was so focused on building my practice that I missed them. The warning signs had started small, as they often did. Robert's suggestions about her appearance, his opinions about which clients she should prioritize, his subtle criticisms of her friends and colleagues. At first, Sarah had interpreted these as signs of his investment in their relationship, his desire to help her succeed. It wasn't until after their engagement that the control began to tighten in more obvious ways. "He wanted me to sell my practice and work for him," Sarah continued. "Said he was developing a large ranch property and needed someone to manage the livestock side of the business. It seemed like a reasonable career move, combining my veterinary skills with business development. What I didn't realize was that it was really about isolating me from my professional network and making me financially dependent on him." Jake listened without comment, but he could feel anger building in his chest as Sarah's story unfolded. He'd seen enough predatory behavior in his dealings with livestock to recognize the patterns she was describing. The gradual isolation, the erosion of independence, the systematic dismantling of support systems that might offer alternative perspectives or escape routes. The veterinary practice Sarah had worked so hard to build was sold under pressure from Robert, who convinced her that their combined business venture would be more profitable and allow them to work together as partners. The reality had been very different. Once she was financially dependent on him, Robert's true nature began to emerge more clearly. "The first time he hit me," Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "he was so apologetic afterward. Flowers, expensive jewelry, promises that it would never happen again. He said the stress of his business dealings had gotten to him, that he'd never behaved that way before." She shook her head slowly. "I wanted to believe him because admitting the truth would have meant acknowledging that I'd made a terrible mistake. The pattern that followed was depressingly familiar to anyone who'd studied domestic violence. Periods of apparent normalcy, followed by escalating abuse. Each incident followed by apologies and promises of change that became increasingly hollow. Robert's control expanded to encompass every aspect of Sarah's life, from what she wore to where she went to whom she could speak with. "He isolated me systematically," Sarah continued. "Made it difficult for me to maintain friendships, criticized my family until I stopped visiting them, controlled our social circle so that everyone we spent time with was either his employee or someone who owed him favors. I started to doubt my own perceptions, to wonder if maybe I was overreacting or misunderstanding his intentions." Jake recognized the gaslighting tactics Sarah described, the way Robert had systematically undermined her confidence in her own judgment while positioning himself as the only reliable source of truth in her life. It was a form of psychological warfare designed to break down resistance and create complete dependence. The breaking point had come 6 months ago, when Sarah had witnessed something that made her realize the full extent of Robert's dangerous nature. She'd been working late at the ranch office, reviewing veterinary records for the cattle operation that was supposedly the foundation of their business partnership, when she'd overheard a conversation between Robert and several men she didn't recognize. They were discussing a land deal, Sarah said, her voice tight with remembered fear. But it wasn't a normal business transaction. They were talking about forcing property owners to sell, about making life difficult for anyone who refused their offers. One man mentioned burning barns and killing livestock to convince stubborn ranchers to accept buyout terms. What Sarah had witnessed was a criminal conspiracy, a systematic campaign of intimidation and property destruction designed to force small ranchers off their land so that Robert could acquire their properties at below-market prices. The veterinary practice had been a cover, a way to gain access to ranches and identify vulnerable targets for his expansion schemes. I realized that my work, the veterinary calls I'd been making to struggling ranches, had been providing him with intelligence, Sarah said, self-recrimination clear in her voice. I'd been unknowingly helping him identify which operations were most vulnerable, which families were most likely to be desperate enough to sell cheaply. When Sarah had confronted Robert about what she'd overheard, his mask had finally fallen away completely. The charming facade she'd fallen in love with disappeared, replaced by a cold fury that she'd dared to question his activities. The beating that followed had been severe enough to require medical attention, but Robert had taken her to a private clinic where his money ensured silence and cooperation. He told me that I was now a full partner in his business, Sarah said, unconsciously touching the faded bruises on her face. That what I'd witnessed made me complicit, and that if I ever tried to expose him, he'd make sure I was charged as an accessory. He said no one would believe me anyway, that I was just a disturbed woman making accusations against a respected businessman. The psychological manipulation had been as devastating as the physical abuse. Robert had convinced Sarah that she was trapped, that speaking out would only result in her own destruction while leaving him free to continue his criminal activities. He'd isolated her so completely that she had no one to turn to for help, no support system that hadn't been contaminated by his influence. For months, Sarah had lived in a state of controlled terror, going through the motions of their engagement, while desperately looking for a way to escape. Robert had made it clear that he considered her his property, that any attempt to leave would result in consequences she wouldn't survive. He'd shown her news articles about suspicious accidents that had befallen people who'd crossed him, making his threats clear without stating them explicitly. The opportunity for escape had come 3 days ago, when Robert had been called away on urgent business, leaving Sarah alone at the ranch for the first time in months. She'd grabbed what cash she could find, along with evidence she'd been secretly gathering about his criminal activities, and fled in one of the ranch vehicles. But Robert's network was extensive, and she'd been spotted before she could reach safety. I ditched the car about 30 miles from here, Sarah said. I knew he'd be tracking it, and I thought if I could just get far enough away, find somewhere to hide until I could figure out how to expose him safely. She looked at Jake with gratitude mixed with fear. I never expected someone like you to find me, to offer help without asking questions or demanding explanations. Jake felt the full weight of what Sarah had shared settling on him like a physical burden. She wasn't just running from an abusive relationship. She was fleeing from a dangerous criminal with the resources and connections to track her down anywhere she might try to hide. By offering her sanctuary, he potentially made himself a target as well, but that consideration barely registered against his anger at what she'd endured. This Robert Carson, Jake said carefully. He's got enough resources to track you down. Even out here? Sarah nodded grimly. He has contacts throughout the region, people who owe him favors or work for him directly. It's not just about finding me anymore. It's about making sure I can never testify against him. The evidence I took could destroy his entire operation if it reached the right people. The evidence Sarah had gathered consisted of financial records, recorded conversations, and documentation of the intimidation campaigns against various ranchers. It was comprehensive enough to trigger a federal investigation if it reached law enforcement. But getting it to the right people without exposing herself to retaliation was the challenge she'd been struggling with. Why not just turn it over to the FBI? Jake asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Sarah's expression confirmed his suspicions. Because Robert has people in law enforcement too. Not everyone, but enough that I can't be sure who to trust. The first attempt to expose him could also be the last if the information reaches the wrong person. Jake understood the dilemma Sarah faced. In a region where business and politics were closely intertwined, where personal relationships often trumped professional obligations, corruption could run deep enough to compromise even federal agencies. Sarah needed allies she could trust absolutely, people with the knowledge and connections to ensure her evidence reached incorruptible hands. As they sat in the gathering darkness, Jake realized that Sarah's arrival at his ranch represented more than just an opportunity to help someone in need. Her veterinary expertise was exactly what he'd been praying for as calving season approached, but more than that, her presence had already begun to fill the emotional void that had been consuming him. The question now was whether they could find a way to neutralize the threat Robert Carson represented before his resources and connections tracked them down. The sound of a vehicle approaching on the distant road made them both freeze, and Jake saw the terror that flashed across Sarah's face before she controlled it. False alarm, as it turned out, just a neighbor taking a late-night drive. But the incident reminded them both that their sanctuary was only as secure as their ability to remain hidden. Robert Carson was still out there, still searching, and sooner or later, he would expand his search to include remote ranches where a desperate woman might seek refuge. Part 4. Building trust. The days that followed Sarah's revelation settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Jake had expected the knowledge of her dangerous situation to create tension between them, but instead, it seemed to deepen their connection. Shared secrets created intimacy, and the weight of protecting each other fostered a partnership that grew stronger with each passing day. Sarah threw herself into ranch work with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. Her veterinary training gave her insights into cattle behavior and health that Jake had been lacking, and she quickly became invaluable as calving season approached. More than that, her presence transformed the daily rhythms of ranch life from solitary labor into collaborative effort. Jake found himself looking forward to morning coffee conversations, to working alongside someone who understood both the challenges and rewards of caring for animals. The first calf arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, and Sarah's expertise proved its worth immediately. Jake had been checking the expectant cows since before dawn, and when he found Bessie, one of his most reliable mothers, showing signs of distress, he knew they were facing complications. In previous years, such situations had filled him with dread, knowing that his limited knowledge might not be sufficient to save both mother and calf. With Sarah guiding him, the delivery became a learning experience rather than a crisis. She talked him through the process of examining the cow, identifying the problem, a breech presentation that required careful repositioning, and executing the delicate maneuvers necessary to save both animals. Her hands were skilled and confident, her voice calm and reassuring as she explained each step of the process. "You're a natural at this," Sarah said as they watched the newborn calf take its first wobbly steps. There was genuine admiration in her voice, and Jake felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the satisfaction of a successful delivery. "Your instincts are good, and you read the animals well. You just needed someone to teach you the technical aspects." The successful delivery marked a turning point in their relationship. Jake began to see Sarah not just as someone he was protecting, but as a true partner in the work he loved. Her knowledge complemented his experience, and together they made a formidable team. More calves arrived over the following weeks, and their collaboration became increasingly seamless, built on growing trust and mutual respect. Evenings found them on the porch, reviewing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's tasks. These conversations gradually expanded beyond ranch business to encompass their backgrounds, their dreams, their fears about the future. Jake learned about Sarah's childhood on a small farm, her decision to pursue veterinary medicine, her pride in building a successful practice before Robert had destroyed it. Sarah heard about Jake's family history, his father's legacy, his struggles with loneliness, and the pressure of maintaining the ranch alone. "I've been thinking about your situation," Jake said one evening as they watched storm clouds gather over the mountains. "About Robert and the evidence you have. Maybe it's time to reach out to someone who can help." Sarah tensed at the mention of her ex-fiancé, but she didn't shut down the conversation as she might have weeks earlier. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted. "Being here, feeling safe for the first time in months, it's made me realize that hiding forever isn't really living. Robert wins if I spend the rest of my life running from him." There was steel in her voice now, a determination that hadn't been there when Jake first found her on the highway. They discussed options carefully, weighing the risks and benefits of various approaches. Sarah's evidence was compelling, but presenting it safely required careful planning and the right contacts. Jake suggested reaching out to Sheriff Linda Garrett in Pine Valley, a woman known for her integrity and her willingness to take on difficult cases, but Sarah was understandably cautious about involving local law enforcement. "What if we start smaller?" Sarah suggested. "What if we reach out to some of the ranchers Robert has targeted? If we can document the pattern of intimidation, build a broader case with multiple victims willing to testify, it becomes harder for him to silence everyone." The idea had merit, and they began developing a plan to carefully contact ranchers who might have been affected by Robert's schemes. The first approach was to the Morrison family, whose ranch bordered Jake's property to the south. Jim Morrison was a third-generation rancher who'd been struggling financially in recent years, and Jake had heard rumors that he'd been approached by land developers. If Robert was involved in those approaches, Jim might be willing to share information about intimidation tactics or suspicious offers. Sarah suggested that Jake make the initial contact, since approaching the Morrisons as a neighbor seeking to trade information would seem natural. The conversation, when it finally happened, proved more revealing than either of them had expected. Jim Morrison had indeed been approached by Robert Carson's organization, and the pressure tactics had escalated when he refused their initial offers. "Started with lowball offers for my land," Jim explained when Jake visited him under the pretense of discussing shared fence maintenance. "When I said no, things got weird. Cattle got loose 3 times in 1 month. Never had that problem before. Then my hay barn caught fire. Insurance said it was electrical, but the wiring had been fine. The week before." The pattern was exactly what Sarah had overheard in Robert's office, and Jim's willingness to talk suggested that other ranchers might have similar stories. But reaching out to potential victims carried risks, particularly if Robert had informants among the local ranching community. Each contact had to be carefully planned and executed to avoid tipping off their investigation. As they developed their strategy, Jake and Sarah's partnership deepened beyond their shared work and common cause. The long hours spent together, the intimate conversations about their hopes and fears, the simple domestic routines they'd fallen into, all contributed to a growing emotional connection that neither of them had expected when Sarah first arrived at the ranch. Jake found himself noticing small details about Sarah that had nothing to do with her veterinary skills or her dangerous situation. The way she hummed unconsciously while working, the concentration that furrowed her brow when she was examining a cow, the genuine joy she took in successful deliveries and healthy calves. These observations weren't clinical or protective. They were the noticing of a man becoming interested in a woman as more than just a colleague or someone in need of help. Sarah, for her part, was discovering what it felt like to be valued for her skills and appreciated for her contributions rather than controlled and diminished. Jake's respect for her knowledge, his willingness to learn from her, his obvious pleasure in her company, all stood in stark contrast to Robert's possessive manipulation. She was remembering who she'd been before Robert had systematically destroyed her confidence and independence. The attraction growing between them was complicated by their circumstances. Sarah was still technically engaged to Robert, though she considered that relationship over in every meaningful sense. More importantly, she was still in danger, and Jake was risking his own safety by protecting her. Neither of them wanted to complicate their situation with romantic feelings that might cloud their judgment or create additional vulnerabilities. But attraction, particularly the kind built on mutual respect and shared purpose, has its own momentum. They found themselves standing closer together when examining cattle, letting conversations stretch later into the evening, stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. The awareness between them was growing stronger despite their attempts to focus solely on practical matters. One evening, as they worked together to deliver a particularly difficult calf, their collaboration reached a level of synchronization that felt almost telepathic. Sarah guided Jake through the complex process of repositioning the calf for delivery, their hands working together with a precision that spoke of perfect trust and understanding. When the calf finally emerged healthy and breathing, their shared relief and joy created a moment of pure connection. "We make a good team," Sarah said, her voice soft with exhaustion and satisfaction. They were sitting in the barn, watching the new mother clean her calf, both of them covered in the honest dirt of hard work well done. Jake nodded. but there was something in his expression that suggested he was thinking about more than just their veterinary partnership. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, clearly wrestling with whether to voice whatever he was thinking. She looked at him encouragingly, sensing the importance of whatever he was struggling to say. "When this is over, when Robert is no longer a threat, would you consider staying? Not just as someone I'm helping, but as a partner in this ranch?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond business arrangements. Sarah felt her heart racing, not with the fear that had become so familiar over the past months, but with hope and possibility. The idea of staying, of building a life here with Jake, had been growing in her mind for weeks, but she'd been afraid to acknowledge it even to herself. "I've been hoping you'd ask," she said quietly, and the smile that spread across Jake's face was worth all the risks they'd taken to reach this moment. They didn't kiss, didn't make grand declarations, but something shifted between them that night. In the barn, they were no longer just allies against a common threat. They were partners planning a future together. The emotional breakthrough gave new urgency to their efforts to neutralize Robert's threat. They couldn't move forward with their lives while he remained a danger, and they couldn't remain hidden on the ranch indefinitely. The evidence Sarah had gathered needed to reach the right people, and they needed to find a way to ensure her safety. While that process played out, their investigation of Robert's intimidation tactics was yielding results, but slowly. 3 more ranchers had confirmed experiencing suspicious incidents after refusing land deals with Robert's organization, and Sarah's financial records provided clear links between the buyout offers and subsequent accidents. They were building a case, but they needed more time to make it comprehensive enough to ensure Robert's conviction. Time, however, was a luxury they might not have. Jake had noticed unfamiliar vehicles on distant roads, casual inquiries from strangers in Pine Valley, signs that suggested Robert's search for Sarah was expanding and intensifying. Their sanctuary was secure for now, but it wouldn't remain so forever. Soon, they would need to choose between continuing to hide and taking the offensive against a dangerous man with extensive resources and few scruples about how he used them. As they sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become Sarah's refuge, both of them knew that their time of relative safety was drawing to a close. The partnership they'd built, the love that was growing between them, the future they were beginning to envision together, all of it depended on finding a way to neutralize Robert Carson's threat without getting themselves killed in the process. The next phase of their story would require courage neither of them was sure they possessed, but they would face it together. Whatever came next, they were no longer alone, no longer fighting their separate battles in isolation. They had each other, and sometimes that was enough to tip the balance between survival and destruction. Part 5. The plan 2 months after Sarah's arrival at the ranch, the partnership between her and Jake had evolved into something neither of them had expected when she first stumbled into his life. Their professional collaboration had deepened into personal connection, their shared purpose had become genuine affection, and their mutual protection had grown into the foundation of a relationship that felt surprisingly solid despite the extraordinary circumstances that had created it. The calving season had been the most successful in the ranch's recent history, with Sarah's expertise helping to save calves that Jake would have lost in previous years. More than that, her presence had transformed the emotional landscape of the ranch from lonely struggle to shared endeavor. Jake found himself looking forward to each day not just because of the work they would accomplish together, but because of the conversations they would share, the small moments of connection that made even the hardest labor feel meaningful. But the shadow of Robert Carson's threat continued to loom over their growing happiness. Sarah's evidence against him had been supplemented by testimonies from affected ranchers, creating a comprehensive picture of his criminal activities, but getting that evidence to the right authorities remained a dangerous challenge. Every day they delayed increased the risk that Robert would track Sarah down, but moving too quickly might expose her to retaliation before law enforcement could act. The solution came from an unexpected source. Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served Pine Valley and the surrounding ranch community, had been making his regular pastoral visits to isolated families when he'd stopped by Jake's ranch. Father Miguel was a man in his 60s who'd served rural communities for most of his career, and his experience had taught him to recognize when people were carrying burdens too heavy for them to bear alone. "You both seem troubled," Father Miguel observed over coffee in Jake's kitchen, his weathered face kind but perceptive. "Is there something I can help with?" Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, both of them weighing how much they could safely reveal. Father Miguel's reputation for discretion was well known, and his connections throughout the region might prove valuable, but involving him would also put him at risk. Sarah made the decision for both of them. "Father, what would you do if you had evidence of serious crimes, but you weren't sure who in law enforcement could be trusted to handle it safely?" The question was carefully phrased, but Father Miguel was experienced enough to read between the lines. "That's a serious situation," the priest replied thoughtfully. "Are we talking about corruption that might extend to local authorities?" Sarah nodded, and Father Miguel considered his response carefully. "I have a contact in the state attorney general's office, someone I've known for 20 years. She's beyond reproach, and she has the resources to investigate complex criminal enterprises without tipping off potential accomplices." Father Miguel's offer represented the breakthrough they'd been hoping for, but it also meant making a commitment to move forward with their plan to expose Robert. Once they contacted the Attorney General's office, there would be no going back, no return to the quiet sanctuary they'd built together on the ranch. They would be committed to seeing the investigation through, regardless of the personal cost. "There's something else you should know," Father Miguel continued, his expression growing more serious. "I've heard rumors about land developers pressuring ranchers in the region. Nothing specific, but enough to suggest that whatever situation you're dealing with isn't isolated. If you have evidence of criminal activity, it might be part of a larger pattern that needs investigation." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The scope of Robert's operation was apparently larger than even she had realized, extending beyond the specific cases she'd witnessed to encompass a systematic campaign against rural landowners throughout the region. The evidence she'd gathered might be just the tip of a criminal iceberg that had been growing for years without effective opposition. Over the following week, Jake and Sarah worked with Father Miguel to develop a plan for safely transferring Sarah's evidence to the Attorney General's office. The priest's contact, Deputy Attorney General Maria Gonzalez, had built her reputation prosecuting organized crime and political corruption. More importantly, her office operated independently of local law enforcement agencies, reducing the risk that Robert's potential contacts could interfere with the investigation. The plan they developed was necessarily complex, designed to protect Sarah while ensuring the evidence reached its destination intact. Father Miguel would make the initial contact, describing the situation in general terms without revealing Sarah's identity or location. If Deputy Attorney General Gonzalez was interested in pursuing the case, they would arrange a secure meeting where Sarah could present her evidence and testimony in person. "The key is timing," Father Miguel explained during one of their planning sessions. "Once we make contact with the Attorney General's office, Robert will eventually learn that an investigation is underway. We need to make sure Sarah is in protective custody before that happens, and we need to ensure that all the evidence is preserved and duplicated in case something happens to the originals." The logistics of the plan required careful coordination. Sarah's evidence would be copied and stored in multiple secure locations, with Father Miguel keeping one set and Jake maintaining another at a location away from the ranch. Sarah herself would need to remain hidden until the Attorney General's office could provide official protection, which might take weeks to arrange depending on their current caseload and the complexity of the investigation. During this period of preparation, Jake and Sarah's relationship continued to evolve. The knowledge that their time together might soon be interrupted by legal proceedings and protective custody arrangements gave new urgency to their growing feelings for each other. They found themselves stealing moments of intimacy between the practical demands of ranch work and investigation planning, building memories to sustain them through whatever separated them in the coming months. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching lightning flicker over the distant mountains, Sarah broached a subject they'd both been avoiding. "When this is over," she said quietly, "when Robert is in prison and I'm free to live my life again, what happens to us?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with uncertainty about the future and fear that their relationship might not survive the transition from crisis to normal life. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I've been thinking about that too," he said finally. "What we have here, it's been built under extraordinary circumstances. I can't help wondering if it will feel the same when the danger is gone, when we're not depending on each other for survival." His honesty was painful but necessary, acknowledging the possibility that their feelings might be more about circumstance than genuine compatibility. Sarah nodded, appreciating his directness even as it highlighted her own fears. "I've wondered the same thing," she admitted. "Everything between us has been intensified by the situation we're in. But Jake, what I feel for you, it's not just gratitude or dependence. It's not just because you saved me or because we work well together. It's something deeper than that." The conversation that followed was the most honest they'd had about their relationship, stripping away the protective layers they'd maintained even as their feelings had grown stronger. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their concerns, about whether love born in crisis could survive in ordinary circumstances. By the end of the evening, they'd reached an understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead, they wanted to face them together. "I love you," Jake said. The words simple but weighted with everything they'd shared and everything they hoped for. "Not because of what we've been through, but because of who you are. Because of how you've changed my life, how you've made this place feel like home again." Sarah's response was wordless, but the kiss they shared said everything that needed to be said about their commitment to each other and their determination to build a future together. The next morning brought news that would test their resolve and accelerate their timeline. Betty Williams from the general store called to report that strangers had been asking questions in Pine Valley, specifically about anyone who might have seen a woman matching Sarah's description. The inquiries were casual, designed to seem like routine investigation, but the description was too accurate to be coincidental. "They showed up yesterday afternoon," Betty explained when Jake drove into town to learn more. "3 men in suits. Said they were from an insurance company investigating a claim. But insurance investigators don't usually offer cash rewards for information, and they don't get as insistent as these fellows did when people say they can't help them." Jake felt his blood run cold. Robert's people had expanded their search to include Pine Valley, which meant it was only a matter of time before they started investigating the surrounding ranches. The 15 miles between town and Jake's property would provide some protection, but not for long if Robert was systematic. About his search, Tommy Rodriguez had more disturbing news. "One of those men came by the garage," the young mechanic reported. "Asked if I'd seen any vehicles that didn't belong in the area, said they were tracking a stolen car. But he was looking at my customer list while he talked, trying to see who'd been bringing vehicles in for service." The implication was clear. Robert's people were building a comprehensive picture of the local community, identifying everyone who might have had contact with Sarah. Father Miguel's contact with the Attorney General's office took on new urgency. They couldn't wait for the careful, methodical approach they'd originally planned. Sarah needed official protection immediately before Robert's investigation led him to Jake's ranch. The priest promised to accelerate his outreach to Deputy Attorney General Gonzalez, but warned that rushing the process increased the risks for everyone involved. "Government agencies move slowly for good reasons," Father Miguel explained. "They need time to verify information, to set up protective measures, to ensure that their investigation won't be compromised by leaks. But I understand the urgency of your situation. I'll do everything I can to speed up the process." The waiting was excruciating. Every vehicle that appeared on the distant road, every unexpected sound in the night, every phone call from town sent adrenaline surging through both Jake and Sarah's systems. They took precautions, establishing escape routes and communication protocols, but they both knew that if Robert's people found the ranch, their options would be limited and dangerous. 3 days after the strangers had appeared in Pine Valley, Father Miguel brought news that changed everything. Deputy Attorney General Gonzalez had agreed to meet with Sarah, but the meeting would need to happen within the next 48 hours. A federal investigation into land fraud schemes had been authorized, and Sarah's evidence could provide the key to breaking open a case that had been developing for months. "She can provide protective custody," Father Miguel explained, "but only if Sarah is willing to testify before a federal grand jury. The evidence alone isn't enough. They need her personal testimony about what she witnessed and experienced." The offer was exactly what they'd been hoping for, but it came with strings attached that would change Sarah's life dramatically. Entering federal protection would mean leaving Montana, possibly for years while the investigation and prosecution proceeded. It would mean separation from Jake and the life they'd been building together, isolation from the community that had become her refuge. Most importantly, it would mean testifying against Robert, facing him in court, reliving the trauma he'd inflicted while his lawyers tried to discredit her testimony. "I have to do it," Sarah said after they'd discussed the options extensively. "Not just for my own safety, but for all the ranchers he's victimized, for everyone he might hurt in the future. I have evidence that could stop him, and I can't let fear prevent me from using it." Her decision was brave but heartbreaking, representing both the end of their sanctuary and the beginning of a long, uncertain separation. The logistics of the transfer were complex and dangerous. Sarah would need to travel to a secure location in Billings, where she would meet with federal agents and be taken into protective custody. Jake would remain at the ranch, maintaining the appearance that nothing had changed while federal investigators began their work. Any contact between them would need to be routed through official channels, carefully monitored to prevent Roberts people from tracking Sarah's location. As they prepared for what might be their last night together for months, Jake and Sarah tried to focus on the positive aspects of their situation. Robert would finally be held accountable for his crimes. Sarah would be safe from his retaliation, and once the legal proceedings were complete, they could begin building a normal life together. But the uncertainty was overwhelming, and neither of them could shake the fear that something might go wrong during the transition. "Promise me something," Sarah said as they lay together in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the sounds of the ranch awakening around them. "Promise me that no matter how long this takes, no matter what happens during the investigation, you won't give up on us. Don't let Robert take this away from us too." Jake's promise was fierce and absolute. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he said. "This ranch will be here when you come back, and so will I. We've built something real here, something worth fighting for. Robert can't destroy that no matter what he does." The words were meant to reassure them both, but they couldn't eliminate the fear that separation and time might accomplish what Robert's direct threats had failed to achieve. The morning of Sarah's departure arrived gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains like an omen of the difficult times ahead. Federal agents had arranged to meet her at a rest stop 30 miles from the ranch, a location chosen for its isolation and the multiple escape routes it provided. Jake would drive her there, then return to the ranch to wait for news about the investigation's progress. As they made their final preparations, checking and rechecking that all evidence had been properly copied and secured, Jake found himself memorizing details about Sarah that he'd taken for granted during their months together. The way she moved with quiet confidence around the animals, the concentration that furrowed her brow when she was thinking through a complex problem, the genuine joy she took in the simple pleasures of ranch life. These memories would need to sustain him through however long they were separated. The drive to the meeting point was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The familiar landscape they passed seemed different now, charged with the knowledge that Sarah was seeing it for possibly the last time in months or years. Every mile that passed brought them closer to the moment when she would disappear into federal protection, beyond Robert's reach, but also beyond Jake's. At the rest stop, 2 unmarked vehicles were waiting as promised. The federal agents were professional but kind, understanding the emotional difficulty of the situation even as they maintained necessary security protocols. They explained that Sarah would be debriefed over several days, that her testimony would be taken and verified, and that the investigation would proceed as quickly as possible while maintaining thoroughness and security. "We understand this is difficult," Agent Jennifer Walsh told them as the transfer preparations were completed. "But Ms. Hayes' testimony is crucial to stopping a criminal organization that has victimized dozens of families. Her courage in coming forward will help ensure that others don't suffer as she has." The words were meant to be comforting, but they couldn't ease the pain of separation or the uncertainty about when they might see each other again. The goodbye was necessarily brief, conducted under the watchful eyes of federal agents who were anxious to get Sarah to a secure location before Robert's people realized she'd disappeared. Jake and Sarah's final words were private, whispered, promises and declarations of love that would need to carry them through however long they were apart. As Jake watched the federal vehicles disappear down the highway, carrying Sarah away from the ranch that had become their sanctuary, He felt an emptiness that was different from the loneliness he'd experienced before her arrival. This wasn't the isolation of someone who'd never found connection. It was the specific pain of someone who'd found love and then had to watch it disappear, potentially forever. The drive back to the ranch gave Jake time to process what had just happened and what lay ahead. Sarah was safe, which was the most important thing, but she was also gone, leaving him to face an uncertain future alone. The ranch that had been transformed by her presence would now feel empty again, but this time the emptiness would be filled with memories of what they'd shared and hopes for what they might share again. The federal investigation would proceed according to its own timeline, with outcomes that neither Jake nor Sarah could control. All they could do was trust that the system would work, that Robert would be brought to justice, and that eventually they would be reunited. In the meantime, Jake would continue running the ranch, maintaining the life they'd built together, keeping faith that love could survive separation and that their story would eventually have the happy ending they both deserved. The months that followed Sarah's departure tested Jake's resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The ranch felt cavernous without her presence, every familiar routine now a reminder of what he'd lost. The successful calving season they'd shared became a bittersweet memory as he struggled through the daily tasks that had once been collaborative efforts filled with conversation and shared purpose. Each morning brought the same hollow ache, the reaching for coffee cups that would remain half empty, the preparation of meals for one that seemed to mock the domestic harmony they'd briefly enjoyed. Federal Agent Walsh called periodically with updates that revealed little about Sarah's condition or the investigation's progress. "Ms. Hayes is safe and cooperating fully with our inquiry," became the standard response to Jake's increasingly desperate questions about when he might see her again. The investigation had expanded beyond Robert Carson's land fraud schemes to encompass a multi-state network of criminal enterprises, meaning the timeline for prosecution had stretched from months to potentially years. Jake threw himself into ranch work with an intensity that bordered on obsession, rising before dawn to check cattle, mending fences that didn't need repair, organizing equipment that was already perfectly maintained. Physical exhaustion became his strategy for managing the emotional pain of separation, but even the most demanding days couldn't entirely silence the worry that gnawed at him during quiet moments. Late at night, alone in the house that still carried traces of Sarah's presence, he wondered if she was thinking of him, if she regretted their decision to involve federal authorities, if the love they discovered together could survive the strain of indefinite separation. The community of Pine Valley rallied around Jake in ways that surprised him. Betty Williams began stopping by the ranch weekly, ostensibly to deliver supplies, but actually to check on his well-being and provide the human contact he was clearly missing. Tommy Rodriguez appeared regularly to help with mechanical repairs, his easy conversation and youthful energy providing brief respites from Jake's isolation. Even Father Miguel made more frequent pastoral visits, understanding that Jake needed spiritual guidance to navigate the uncertainty of his situation. Faith requires patience, the priest reminded Jake during one particularly difficult evening when news of the investigation's expansion had pushed the projected timeline even further into the future. What you and Sarah have built together is real, but it's being tested in ways that will either strengthen it beyond measure or reveal its limitations. You have to trust that love this genuine can endure whatever challenges it faces. The words provided some comfort, but Jake struggled with the practical implications of indefinite separation. His life was tied to the ranch by obligations and responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned, while Sarah existed in a protected bubble where normal communication was impossible and future plans remained completely uncertain. They were living in parallel universes that had briefly intersected but now seemed destined to remain forever separate. 6 months after Sarah's departure, unexpected news arrived that changed everything. Agent Walsh called with information that the federal investigation had achieved a major breakthrough, resulting in indictments against Robert Carson and 17 associates in his criminal organization. More importantly, Sarah's testimony had been crucial in securing these indictments, and the prosecution was confident enough in their case to begin reducing security restrictions on key witnesses. Ms. Hayes will be able to resume limited contact with family and close friends, Agent Walsh explained. Phone calls will be monitored and her location will remain confidential. but she's expressed strong interest in re-establishing communication with you specifically. The news hit Jake like a physical blow, relief and excitement and nervousness combining in a rush of emotion that left him temporarily speechless. The first phone call came 3 days later, Sarah's voice crackling through a connection that was clearly secured but couldn't disguise the emotion in her words. "Jake," she said, and just hearing his name in her voice was enough to bring tears to his eyes. "I've missed you so much. I've missed the ranch, missed our conversations, missed everything about the life we were building together." They talked for an hour, catching up on the months of separation while carefully avoiding topics that might compromise the ongoing investigation. Sarah described the safe house where she'd been living, the endless debriefings and legal preparations, the isolation that mirrored Jake's own experience of separation. But more importantly, she confirmed that her feelings hadn't changed, that the time apart had only strengthened her conviction that their relationship was worth fighting for. "I think about the ranch every day," Sarah said near the end of their conversation. "About the sunrise over the mountains, about working together in the barn, about the future we talked about building. That's what's kept me going through all of this, the knowledge that you're there waiting for me, that we have something real to return to when this nightmare is finally over." The regular phone calls that followed became the anchor that kept Jake grounded during the remaining months of investigation and preparation for trial. Sarah's voice, even filtered through federal security protocols, brought life back to the ranch house that had felt like a tomb. They planned improvements to the property, discussed expanding the cattle operation, shared dreams about the family they might eventually raise together. These conversations weren't just emotional lifelines. They were investments in a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Robert Carson's trial began 18 months after Sarah had first fled to Jake's ranch, and the media attention surrounding the case revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise she'd helped expose. 23 defendants faced charges, ranging from fraud and extortion to assault and conspiracy, with evidence linking them to dozens of intimidation campaigns against rural landowners across 4 states. Sarah's testimony, when it finally came, was devastating in its clarity and detail, providing the personal narrative that transformed financial records and surveillance footage into a compelling story of systematic abuse and criminal conspiracy. Jake attended every day of the trial that he could manage, sitting in the public gallery where Sarah could see him even though they weren't allowed direct contact. Her strength on the witness stand filled him with pride and admiration, watching as she faced down Robert's aggressive defense team with composure and unwavering honesty. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, not the broken fugitive he'd found on the highway, but the confident professional who'd helped transform his ranch and his life. The guilty verdicts came after 3 days of jury deliberation, with Robert Carson receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. His associates received lesser sentences, but substantial enough to dismantle their criminal organization permanently. For Jake and Sarah, the verdicts represented more than justice. They represented freedom to finally begin the normal life together that had been interrupted by federal protection and legal proceedings. Sarah's release from protective custody was scheduled for the week following the sentencing, but Agent Walsh had one final surprise. "Ms. Hayes has requested that her release location be your ranch," she informed Jake during a phone call that left him scrambling to prepare for Sarah's homecoming. She specifically asked to return to the place where she felt safe, where she discovered who she really was beneath all the trauma she'd endured. The preparations for Sarah's return consumed Jake's attention for the week leading up to her arrival. He cleaned the house from top to bottom, planted flower gardens that had been neglected during her absence, organized the barn and equipment areas with the same care he'd shown during their early days together. More than physical preparation, though, he found himself emotionally preparing for a reunion that would determine whether their relationship could transition from crisis partnership to normal domestic life. The morning of Sarah's return dawned clear and bright, with spring sunshine warming the valley and highlighting the new growth that covered the pastures where their cattle grazed. Jake had been awake since before dawn, nervous energy making sleep impossible, checking and rechecking arrangements that were already perfect. When the federal vehicles finally appeared on the distant road, his heart began racing with anticipation and anxiety about whether the woman who emerged would still be the Sarah he remembered and loved. She was thinner than when she'd left, the stress of 18 months in protective custody evident in her face and posture, but her smile when she saw him was brilliant with genuine joy. The federal agents performed their final security checks and paperwork, but Jake barely noticed their presence. His attention was completely focused on Sarah, on the reality that she was finally, truly safe and free to choose her own future. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," Sarah said, looking out over the ranch as the federal vehicles disappeared down the road, leaving them alone together for the first time in over a year. "I used to dream about this view during the worst moments of the investigation, when I thought I might never see it again." Her voice was thick with emotion, and Jake could see tears threatening as the full impact of her freedom settled over her. They stood together on the porch where they'd shared so many evening conversations, where they'd first acknowledged their growing feelings for each other, where they'd made the difficult decision to involve federal authorities in their fight against Robert. The place looked the same, but they had both been changed by their experiences, tested by separation and stress in ways that had either strengthened their connection or revealed its limitations. "I need to know," Sarah said, turning to face Jake directly, "that what we had here was real, that it wasn't just circumstances and danger that brought us together. I need to know that you still want the future we talked about, that you're not just being kind to someone who's been through trauma." Her vulnerability was heartbreaking, revealing the doubts that had plagued her during months of isolation and uncertainty. Jake's response was immediate and absolute. "Sarah, what we built here was the most real thing I've ever experienced. Not because of the danger, but in spite of it. You changed my life in ways that had nothing to do with protecting you and everything to do with discovering what partnership really means." He took her hands, feeling the familiar electricity of her touch that 18 months of separation hadn't diminished. "I love you. Not the memory of you, not the idea of you, but you, exactly as you are right now." The kiss that followed was tender and desperate, filled with 18 months of longing and uncertainty and relief. When they finally separated, both of them were crying, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. They had survived Robert's threats, federal investigation, endless separation, and legal proceedings. They had emerged stronger and more committed to each other than ever before. "I want to marry you," Jake said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for months. "I want to make this official, make it permanent, build the family and future we've been dreaming about. If you'll have me, if you're ready for that kind of commitment." His proposal was spontaneous but felt completely natural, the logical next step in a relationship that had been tested by extraordinary circumstances and proven unbreakable. Sarah's answer was wordless but unmistakable, her kiss and embrace conveying everything he needed to know about her feelings and intentions. When they could finally speak again, she was laughing through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to marriage. Yes to building a life here. Yes to everything we've been dreaming about. I'm ready to stop running, stop hiding, stop letting fear control our decisions. I'm ready to live." The wedding took place 6 months later in the Pine Valley Community Church, with Father Miguel officiating and half the county in attendance. The community that had protected Sarah's secret and supported Jake through her absence now celebrated their union with genuine joy and relief. Betty Williams had organized a reception that filled the church hall with food and laughter, while Tommy Rodriguez served as best man, his easy grin reflecting the happiness that radiated from the couple he'd helped bring together. Sarah wore a simple white dress that she'd chosen specifically for its lack of ostentation, rejecting the elaborate gown that had been planned for her ill-fated wedding to Robert. This ceremony was about love and commitment rather than display, about two people choosing each other freely rather than one person being claimed by another. The vows they exchanged were personal and heartfelt, promises to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. The honeymoon was spent at the ranch, working together to expand the operation and prepare for the future they'd planned during those long months of separation. Sarah's veterinary practice was re-established, serving ranchers throughout the region, who'd heard about her expertise and her role in exposing Robert's criminal organization. Jake's cattle operation flourished under their joint management, with Sarah's medical knowledge complementing his practical experience in ways that made them formidable partners in both business and life. A year after their wedding, Sarah gave birth to their first child. a daughter they named Hope in recognition of the persistence that had sustained them through their darkest times. Holding his daughter in the barn where he'd first seen Sarah's veterinary skills in action, Jake felt a sense of completion that he'd never experienced before. This was what he'd been unconsciously seeking during all those lonely years. Not just companionship, but true partnership. Not just someone to share his bed, but someone to share his dreams and build a legacy together. The ranch that had once felt like a burden too heavy for one person to bear had become a thriving enterprise that reflected the combined efforts and shared vision of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. The house that had echoed with solitude now rang with laughter and conversation and the sounds of family life. The land that had seemed like a trap for someone seeking broader horizons had become a sanctuary where love could flourish and grow. Standing on the porch as evening settled over the valley, watching Sarah play with their daughter while their cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect domestic happiness. It had begun with his desperate loneliness and prayer for help, had continued through danger and separation and uncertainty, and had culminated in a love that felt both miraculous and inevitable. Robert Carson remained in federal prison, his appeals exhausted, his criminal organization permanently dismantled. The ranchers he'd victimized had received compensation and justice, while the community that had suffered under his intimidation campaigns had healed and strengthened. But more than external justice, Jake and Sarah had found internal peace, the knowledge that they'd faced their worst fears together and emerged stronger for the experience. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Sarah joined Jake on the porch, their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I hadn't been walking along that highway?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of long partnership. Jake considered the question, thinking about the loneliness that had defined his existence before her arrival, the empty house and solitary meals, and endless worry about facing life's challenges alone. "I think about it all the time," he said. "Finally, but not because I wish things had been different. I think about it because I'm grateful for every decision and circumstance that brought you to me, even the painful ones. Especially the painful ones, because they taught us what we really mean to each other." The future stretched ahead of them, filled with the ordinary challenges and extraordinary joys that define any life lived fully and shared completely. There would be difficult calvings and failed crops, financial pressures and family disagreements, all the normal struggles that test any partnership. But they would face these challenges together, with the confidence that comes from having survived far worse and emerged stronger for the experience. The second year of their marriage brought challenges that tested Jake and Sarah's partnership in entirely new ways. Spring arrived late that year, with unexpected snowstorms delaying the start of calving season and creating complications that even Sarah's veterinary expertise couldn't entirely prevent. They lost 3 calves in one devastating week, each loss hitting them harder because of the financial pressures they were facing as they expanded the ranch operation to accommodate Sarah's growing practice. The expansion had seemed like a natural progression when they'd planned it during those optimistic months following their wedding. Sarah's reputation as the veterinarian who'd helped expose Robert Carson's criminal organization had brought clients from across the region, ranchers who wanted to support someone who'd stood up for their community. But building the additional facilities needed to house her practice, purchasing specialized equipment, and hiring the support staff required for a full-service veterinary operation had stretched their finances to the breaking point. Jake found himself lying awake at 3 in the morning, calculating feed costs and veterinary supply expenses, wondering if they'd been too ambitious in their expansion plans. The ranch that had supported his family for 3 generations was now carrying debt that made him nervous, obligations that required success rather than merely survival. Sarah shared his concerns, but her optimism about their long-term prospects often clashed with his more cautious approach to financial management. "We're building something bigger than either of us could accomplish alone," Sarah reminded him during one particularly tense discussion about their mounting expenses. "Yes, we're taking risks, but they're calculated risks based on real demand for my services and the growth potential of this region." Her confidence was admirable, but Jake couldn't shake the fear that one bad season, one major equipment failure, One significant loss of clients could destroy everything they'd worked to build. The tension came to a head during a difficult calving that required Sarah's most advanced skills and Jake's steadiest hands. The cow, a valuable breeding animal they couldn't afford to lose, was experiencing complications that threatened both her life and that of her calf. They worked together for 6 hours in the barn, Sarah guiding Jake through increasingly complex procedures as the situation deteriorated despite their best efforts. When they finally lost both the cow and her calf, the financial and emotional impact hit them like a physical blow. Jake slammed his fist against the barn wall in frustration, angry at himself for not recognizing the signs earlier, angry at the circumstances that had put so much pressure on every decision they made. Sarah stood in stunned silence, her medical training telling her they'd done everything possible while her heart broke for the animals they couldn't save. "Maybe we're in over our heads," Jake said, his voice harsh with exhaustion and disappointment. "Maybe we've been kidding ourselves about what we can accomplish here. My father never needed a veterinary practice to make this ranch work. Maybe we're complicating things that should be simple." The words came out harder than he'd intended, but months of financial stress and sleepless nights had worn down his usual diplomatic restraint. Sarah's response was quiet but firm. "Your father also never faced the challenges we're dealing with. He never had to rebuild from the kind of losses we've experienced, never had to establish credibility in a community that had been systematically victimized by criminals. What we're doing here isn't just about making money. It's about proving that people like us can succeed when we support each other." The argument that followed was their first real fight as a married couple, revealing tensions that had been building beneath the surface of their partnership. Jake accused Sarah of being naive about the realities of ranch economics, while Sarah charged Jake with lacking faith in her abilities and their shared vision. The fight ended with both of them storming off to separate parts of the property, each convinced that the other didn't understand the pressures they were facing. They didn't speak for 2 days, moving around each other with careful politeness, while conducting the necessary business of ranch operations. The silence between them was more painful than any argument, highlighting how much their relationship had become the foundation of everything else in their lives. Without the easy communication and shared purpose that had defined their partnership, even simple tasks felt difficult and unsatisfying. Father Miguel's unexpected visit on the 3rd day of their standoff provided the intervention they both needed but had been too proud to seek. The priest took one look at their strained expressions and careful distance from each other and settled himself at their kitchen table with the obvious intention of not leaving until they'd resolved whatever was wrong. "Marriage counseling wasn't part of my seminary training," Father Miguel said with gentle humor, "but 30 years of pastoral work has taught me to recognize when good people are letting circumstances drive them apart instead of drawing them together. What's going on here?" His directness was both uncomfortable and necessary, forcing them to articulate the fears and frustrations they'd been nursing privately. Jake spoke first, explaining his concerns about their financial overextension and his fear that they were risking the ranch his family had built over 3 generations. Sarah followed with her perspective on the growth potential of her practice and her frustration with what she saw as Jake's lack of confidence in their partnership. As they talked, guided by Father Miguel's patient questions, the real issues beneath their conflict began to emerge. "You're both right," the priest said when they'd finished laying out their grievances. "Jake, the financial pressures you're facing are real and deserve serious attention. Sarah, the opportunities you're pursuing have genuine potential and deserve support. But you're treating this as a conflict between 2 opposing approaches when it should be a collaboration between partners with different strengths." The conversation that followed helped them realize that their different perspectives on risk and growth weren't weaknesses to be overcome, but complementary strengths to be balanced. Jake's caution could prevent them from making dangerous mistakes, while Sarah's optimism could push them toward opportunities they might otherwise miss. The key was learning to communicate about their concerns without attacking each other's judgment or commitment. "We've been so focused on proving ourselves individually that we forgot what made us successful in the first place," Sarah admitted as they walked Father Miguel to his car. "We work best when we're truly working together, when we're using both of our perspectives to make better decisions than either of us could make alone." Jake nodded, feeling the relief that came with recognizing a truth he'd been too stubborn to acknowledge. The reconciliation that followed was sweeter for having been earned through honest communication rather than simple apology. They spent the evening redesigning their expansion plans, incorporating Jake's financial caution with Sarah's growth vision to create a more sustainable approach to building their combined operation. The result was a timeline that stretched their goals over several years rather than attempting to accomplish everything immediately, reducing financial pressure while maintaining forward momentum. Summer brought a reprieve from the intense pressures of calving season, but it also brought new challenges in the form of drought conditions that tested every rancher in the region. The grass that should have been green and abundant turned brown and sparse, forcing Jake to supplement his cattle's diet with expensive hay purchased from regions that had received more rainfall. Water became a constant concern, with the creek that normally provided adequate flow reduced to a series of stagnant pools. Sarah's veterinary practice proved invaluable during the drought, as ranchers throughout the area sought her expertise in managing livestock under stress conditions. Her knowledge of nutrition and hydration helped several operations avoid the catastrophic losses that had historically accompanied severe dry spells. More importantly, her success in helping other ranchers weather the crisis established her reputation as someone who could be trusted during difficult times. The drought also brought them closer to their neighbors in ways that prosperity alone never could have accomplished. Ranchers who had previously maintained polite distance began sharing resources and information, recognizing that survival might depend on cooperation rather than competition. Jake and Sarah found themselves at the center of an informal network of mutual support that included everything from shared equipment to joint purchasing agreements for feed and supplies. Betty Williams organized weekly community meetings at the general store, where ranchers could coordinate their responses to the drought and share information about water sources and grazing opportunities. These gatherings became social events, as much as business meetings, providing the human connection that rural people often lacked during normal times. Jake and Sarah's relationship, tested and strengthened by their recent conflicts, became a model for how partnerships could thrive, even under stress. "You two give the rest of us hope," Tommy Rodriguez said during one particularly difficult week when the drought seemed like it might never end. "Seeing how you work together, how you support each other through problems, it reminds us that we don't have to face everything alone." His words reflected a sentiment that Jake heard repeatedly from their neighbors, the recognition that their marriage represented something larger than personal happiness. The drought finally broke in late August with a series of thunderstorms that brought desperately needed rain but also created new challenges in the form of flash flooding and damaged infrastructure. Jake and Sarah worked around the clock to secure their cattle and protect their property, but they also found time to help neighbors who were struggling with storm damage. Their barn became a temporary shelter for livestock displaced by flooding, while Sarah's veterinary skills were in constant demand, treating animals injured by debris or stressed by the upheaval. The recovery period that followed the storms revealed the true strength of the community network that had developed during the drought. Ranchers who had helped each other survive the dry months now collaborated on rebuilding efforts, sharing labor and resources in ways that made everyone stronger. Jake and Sarah's ranch became a coordination center for these efforts, their combination of veterinary expertise and organizational skills making them natural leaders in the recovery process. Fall brought the satisfaction of a successful breeding season despite the challenging year they'd experienced. The cattle that had survived the drought and storms were healthy and productive, validating the careful management decisions Jake and Sarah had made under pressure. More importantly, the calves born that season represented hope for the future, proof that life could flourish even after the most difficult circumstances. Sarah's pregnancy, announced during the first week of October, added another dimension to their sense of renewal and possibility. They had been trying to start a family since their wedding, but the stresses of the past year had made conception difficult. The timing of Sarah's pregnancy, coming just as they'd weathered their most challenging season together, felt like a reward for their perseverance and a promise of continued growth. "I want our children to grow up understanding what we've learned this year," Sarah said as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples. "That challenges make partnerships stronger, that success comes from supporting each other rather than competing, that the best things in life require patience and faith and hard work." Her words reflected the wisdom they'd gained through trial and triumph, lessons that had strengthened their marriage beyond what they'd thought possible. The winter that followed was mild and manageable, giving them time to consolidate the gains they'd made during the difficult year. Sarah's veterinary practice had grown substantially, with clients throughout the region recognizing her expertise and reliability. Jake's cattle operation had survived drought and storms with minimal losses, positioning them well for expansion when conditions improved. Most importantly, their marriage had been tested by financial pressure, professional disagreements, and natural disasters, emerging stronger and more resilient than ever before. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it the promise of renewed growth and fresh possibilities. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly despite her continued work with large animals, her experience and careful approach minimizing the risks that might have concerned other expectant mothers. Jake found himself watching her with new amazement, marveling at her ability to balance the demands of pregnancy with the physical challenges of veterinary work. The birth of their daughter, Emma, named in honor of Sarah's sister who had helped her escape Robert's abuse, marked the completion of their transformation from desperate strangers to thriving family. Holding his newborn daughter in the barn, where he'd first seen Sarah demonstrate her veterinary skills, Jake felt a sense of continuity that connected past struggles to present happiness and future possibilities. Emma's presence transformed the ranch in ways that went beyond the obvious. Changes of cribs and baby equipment scattered throughout the house. Neighbors who had supported Jake and Sarah through their difficulties now celebrated with them, bringing gifts and offering advice and assistance with the generous spirit that characterized rural communities at their best. Father Miguel blessed the baby at a ceremony that filled the small Pine Valley church, while Betty Williams organized a reception that brought together ranchers from across the region. She's going to grow up understanding what real partnership looks like, Tommy Rodriguez said, holding Emma with the careful reverence of a young man who hoped to have children of his own someday. She'll see how her parents support each other, how they've built something beautiful together through hard work and faith. That's a gift that will shape her entire life. His words reflected the broader community's investment in Jake and Sarah's success, their recognition that strong families created stronger communities. The years that followed brought the usual mix of challenges and triumphs that define any life lived fully and purposefully. There were difficult calvings and successful births, financial pressures and profitable seasons, family disagreements and moments of perfect harmony. Through it all, Jake and Sarah maintained the partnership they'd forged during their most difficult times, supporting each other through problems and celebrating successes together. Sarah's veterinary practice expanded to include a satellite clinic in a neighboring county, while Jake's cattle operation grew to encompass additional acreage purchased from retiring neighbors. Their success enabled them to hire employees who shared their commitment to quality and community service, creating jobs that helped stem the exodus of young people from rural areas. Emma grew up surrounded by the sounds and smells of ranch life, learning to read animal behavior and appreciate the rhythms of agricultural life. On her 5th birthday, Emma helped deliver her first calf under Sarah's careful supervision, demonstrating the same natural instincts and gentle touch that had made her mother such an exceptional veterinarian. Watching his daughter work alongside his wife in the same barn where their own partnership had been forged, Jake felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional success or financial security. They had created something lasting and meaningful, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Standing on the porch that evening, watching Sarah and Emma play in the yard while their cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect domestic contentment. It had begun with his desperate loneliness and prayer for help delivering calves and delivering him from isolation. The answer to that prayer had come in the form of a woman fleeing for her life, carrying wounds that seemed too deep to heal and secrets that threatened to destroy them both. What they'd built together had exceeded anything Jake could have imagined during those lonely years before Sarah's arrival. She had indeed helped him deliver calves, bringing professional expertise that had saved countless animals and prevented devastating financial losses. But more than that, she had delivered him from a loneliness so profound he'd almost forgotten what connection felt like. Their partnership had created new life in ways that went far beyond the biological miracle of their daughter's birth. The ranch that had once felt like a burden too heavy for one person to bear had become a thriving enterprise that reflected the combined efforts and shared vision of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds. The house that had echoed with solitude now rang with laughter and conversation and the sounds of family life. The land that had seemed like a trap for someone seeking broader horizons had become a sanctuary where love could flourish and grow. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Sarah joined Jake on the porch, Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms after a day filled with adventure and discovery. "Do you ever think about that first morning when I helped you deliver Bessie's calf?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of long partnership. "How nervous you were about whether I really knew what I was doing." Jake smiled at the memory, thinking about how much had changed since that uncertain beginning when trust had been a fragile thing built on desperation rather than experience. "I think about it all the time," he said, wrapping his arm around his wife and daughter. "Not because I doubted you, but because that was the moment I realized you weren't just someone I was helping. You were someone who was helping me, someone who was going to change my life in ways I couldn't even imagine." The future stretched ahead of them, filled with the ordinary challenges and extraordinary joys that define any life, lived fully and shared completely. There would be difficult seasons and abundant harvests, family celebrations and community struggles, all the normal experiences that test any partnership. But they would face these challenges together, with the confidence that comes from having built something real and lasting through perseverance and faith. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her eyes to gaze up at the stars that were beginning to shine with full brilliance in the clear mountain sky. In her innocent expression, Jake could see reflections of both her parents, the strength and gentleness that had brought them together and would guide their daughter as she grew into her own person. The prayers he'd offered during those lonely years had been answered in ways more wonderful than he'd dared to hope, delivering him from isolation into a love that would sustain and inspire him for the rest of his life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.